Hello, and welcome to the season 2 of the Working While Homeschooling podcast, the podcast for workingwhilehomeschooling.com, where our mission is to help homeschooling parents make money, maybe even have a career, while continuing to homeschool and without losing their sanity. My name is Julie, and I am your host and resident career coach today. I want to thank you all for joining us and listening in. I hope you're doing well. And on today's episode, we'll be speaking to Aili, who works both as a software developer and as an award-winning theater director while homeschooling. So, can you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. My name's Aili Huber, and I live in the Shenandoah Valley in Virginia, which is an incredibly gorgeous and wonderful place. I have two children, Petra and Silas. Petra is 7 and Silas is 9. And we have always homeschooled, so they've never really been to school. And besides homeschooling them, I also work as a freelance software developer. I do web development for a lot of clients, including the Staten Island Ferry and MoveOn.org and small businesses. And I direct plays. So I have like 2 kinds of jobs that I do.
And I know that's a real unique mix. We were talking about that earlier, to throw in and homeschool at the same time. So tell us kind of a little bit, start us off, tell us a little bit about kind of your work situation. You've got 2 big gigs there. How do you manage that? And tell us, how did you get into them?
So several years ago, when my children were very small, in the same week, my husband was laid off from his job, and I did not get a job that I really thought I was going to get and that I've been like working toward for a couple of years. And it was devastating, but it also gave us this chance to sit down and say, what do we want in our lives? And what he said was he wanted to have the kind of job that would let him have a lot of schedule flexibility, where he could work from home a whole bunch and spend time with our children, because being a dad was like the most important thing to him. And I said, well, I want to spend most of my time creating art with exciting and interesting people, but also I want to afford to feed my children. So how will we do that? And we literally just like sat down and started writing down ideas. And that was the time when I came up with this vision that was like, okay, software development is it's very well paid. And it's a skill that I taught myself in my 20s when I was working. I was writing content for Rosetta Stone, which is a language software company. A lot of homeschoolers use it. And while I was there, I kind of made some of my software developer friends teach me how to write software. And so I realized, okay, actually I'm good enough at this. I could do this professionally. And we also looked at how much money do we actually need, right? So if I decided to be a full-time software developer, I could be making fantastic, like ridiculous money, right? But we don't need ridiculous money. We need enough money to keep our little like 1,300 square foot house in decent shape and to feed our children. So I figured out, you know what, actually I could spend about 20% of my work hours doing software and make about 80% of the money I need to live. And that would mean I could then spend 80% of my work hours directing plays and teaching theater and doing workshops and things like that, and probably make about 20% of my money that way. And it took some time to get to that ratio. Software is way easier to find paying work in than theater is. And so I began by reaching out to people who I had done. I used to teach a lot of software development. And so there were different people that I had done training for. And I said, hey, if you liked my training stuff, but you don't actually feel like doing the coding yourself, could I do the coding for you? And so that's how I landed my first few big clients, was through having taught at different places and met people that way. And so I was working on that and getting to the point where I could have a steady amount of work there that would kind of cover most of my expenses. And then on the other side, I was networking with various theaters, both professional theaters and university theater departments. And I did a lot of workshops, and I did a lot of what are called play responses with the Kennedy Center, which the Kennedy Center has this amazing college theater festival, and they send people to respond to plays at lots of colleges and universities. And so what you do is you watch the play, and then after the play, you say to the cast and the crew, here are things I noticed. Here are some questions that I have. Here are some ways I think you might be able to develop your work for the next show that you do. And so I've actually gotten a lot of gigs by doing these responses. So I actually have a response I'm doing tomorrow night because it continues to be a way that I connect with theaters and connect with young artists and find a fair amount of work.
I want to point out two things that I'm hearing you say to the listeners. So even if you're not on the same path, everybody, two things is one, they sat down and they made a plan and they really talked about their life goals and their like life mission and how they wanted their life to work. So even if your end result doesn't look the same, I think that's brilliant, guys. And I definitely recommend it. As a couple, as an individual, like literally how do you want your life to work, and then work your way backwards and figure out how you do that. And the second thing that I think pertains to literally anybody who's listening to this is you just said, I'm getting these jobs through networking. And you guys don't know how important networking is. In the job search world in general, 80% of people get their jobs through some form of networking. It's that big of a deal. So I just wanted to point that out because it's so obvious in your particular story because of exactly how you went about getting it. But I think it's a life lesson that people can kind of learn regardless of what their background is.
Oh, that is 110% true. It's more true, I think, in theater than it is in the software side of what I do. Like, there are never job postings for theater directors. Like, you have to be invited. But it's still true. Like, the best gigs that I've gotten in both of those worlds have definitely been through networking. Like, there are never job postings for theater directors. Like, you have to be invited. But it's still true. Like, the best gigs that I've gotten in both of those worlds have definitely been through networking.
Absolutely.
And never job postings for theater directors. Like, you have to be invited. But it's still true. Like, the best gigs that I've gotten in both of those worlds have definitely been through networking. Networking is so hard. I'm bad at it.
Well, no one.
Really introverted.
Oh yeah. Well, we could spend years talking about having to network while introverted. So I totally get that because I am as well. So let's talk schedule. Like, okay, how in the world do you manage to do all of this and homeschool and hopefully sleep occasionally?
Oh, well, I have really bad insomnia, actually, so it's a bonus.
Okay. Yeah, I get that.
So I'm going to start with the school piece because that's the simplest piece of it all. We're very eclectic homeschoolers. My kids don't do a whole lot of formal school. We're not true unschoolers. Unschoolers have like no patience for me because I do make them do math every day and they have to do some kind of writing or grammar activity every day. But that's like that and some chores is the extent of what I really make them do. And then we do a whole lot of like, we go to the library all the time. We go to museums all the time. They see a ridiculous amount of theater, which is really great, not just for learning about the arts, but also plays are about things, right? So it's rare that you see a play that's about plays. I mean, there are plays like that. That's a whole section of the theater world. But more often, they are about people who are trying to accomplish all kinds of things. And so when you go see a play about, nuclear physicists, you come home with a lot of questions about physics. You go see a play that's set in a particular historical time period, and then you come home and you say, well, tell me, like, what is this Germany Nazi thing about, right? So that ends up being the way that we learn. They also do something every year that I've been homeschooling. I've had some kind of arrangement where I've been able to have at least one, usually 2 days a week, where the kids are out of the house for half the day without me. So it's been a swap with another homeschool family or, various kinds of things like that. This year, they're doing something called Forest School, where they spend 3 mornings a week in the National Forest with a facilitator and a bunch of other kids. And they are loving it. My daughter comes home knowing all kinds of plants that you can eat in the woods and like being able to point out different kinds of lichen or something. She's my little scientist. And my son has a great time playing with kids of all ages, and he constructs these amazing stories for them. And like, I'll hear from parents that their kids came home and told them a story Silas told and that they thought it was from a book. So that's kind of the kids. Oh, and also we do that year round. We do some like the level of education we do, formal education, we do all the time
Right.
because we often have unexpected breaks. So like last week I was working on a show, I was away from home for the week, and they basically, I don't really think they did their math or their writing that week. And because we do it 50, we do it all the time. If we actually are doing 40 weeks a year with like a lot of random breaks, it's fine. So that's the school piece. My software work is I typically work on what I call Tokyo time. So I log in at about 9 p.m. and work for a few hours each night, or I work while the kids are at Forest School. And because software pays well, I work 10 to 15 hours a week on that kind of thing. Sometimes it's more if my clients all have emergencies the same week, but like basically that's an amount of time that I can fit in around my kids and around my schedule. And then usually through most of the year, through like 2/3 of the year, I'm not actively in rehearsal. So during that time, my theater work looks more like I'm teaching a workshop here or there, or I'm in pre-production and having meetings with people about that, or just like reading plays and writing, maintaining my network, right? I write a whole bunch to different theaters that I have contacts with, and I'll say like, oh, I saw this show that you're doing. That's really cool. Here's, so maintaining that all falls under the category of like theater work. And then if I am actively working on a production, I usually have 20 to 30 hours of rehearsal a week and production meetings. And so, but those are usually in the evenings or other times that I can kind of work around, and my husband can deal with the children, and
Right.
and his job is very flexible.
Yeah.
So when
Well,
I'm in production, he
you did mention when we were talking the other day that you're not just doing local theaters; you're having to travel occasionally to theaters further away. And I think honestly, when we as homeschool moms look at those jobs that may have to include travel, sometimes we'll just say, well, forget it because that's not going to happen. But you've been able to make that work. Can you kind of tell us like how you've been able to make those weeks where you're going to be out of town per se work for you guys?
Oh yeah. So sometimes if I'm going to be on for like a month, everyone goes with. My husband's job is such that he can work online a lot. And his boss actually does theater stuff. His boss's dad was my graduate advisor, which was just a random coincidence. And he does lighting for a local theater. And so he's someone who takes the idea that I'm an artist pretty seriously, which is awesome. Because then he's like pretty understanding about the whole thing. So sometimes all of us will go to a different city and live there for a month while I'm working on a show. And that's actually really exciting. My kids really love going to different places and meeting new people and seeing, the different sites of different cities. But if I'm going to be gone for like about a week to 10 days, that is a little, I usually don't take everyone with me because it's just too disruptive. So those weeks, my husband works from home more than he usually does. I often will arrange a swap with a friend where another homeschool family will have my kids for a day, and then like when the show's over, I'll have their kids for a day. My mom lives an hour and a half away, and so sometimes she and my stepdad will take the kids for a couple days. So it's like a week is about the amount that I can kind of patch together with the
Right.
support of my family and my community.
Because that, sometimes I know I've looked at jobs and I'm like, oh my God, that looks like so much fun, but it's like 80% travel. So
Yeah,
no. Yeah, exactly. You've mentioned that your spouse is pretty involved because he is able to work from home, which is awesome. What do your kids kind of think of this kind of crazy, weird, made up situation?
They love it, actually. Like people are always like, oh, your kids get dragged around because you're directing. But they are really into it. They love that their dad gets to work from home so much. They consider that a huge benefit, and they are very aware at this point that a lot of their friends, parents, especially dads, work long hours, and they're only home in the evenings. The kids are really proud of me, which I find adorable. Like they're taking a theater class now, and within 5 minutes of meeting their teacher, they had told her, well, my mom directs plays, so if you need anything, you ask her, which was super cute. And they also are, I think that like now that they're big enough that we have like very serious conversations with them about the kinds of choices we've made in our lives. they have a very more realistic view of what it means to be a working person than I think I did at their age. So like my son wants to be a writer. Um, and I think he's a really good writer already. But he will say things like, I know that, it can be hard to make a decent living as a writer, so maybe I will also be a lighting designer or be a teacher, or like he's got a whole host of other options.
Right.
Um, and I think that that's wonderful. My daughter is less into theater than my son is, but they both really enjoy the performing arts, and I love that they can see that the arts are a totally legitimate way to make a life.
Right. And that is interesting because, as some of the listeners know, if you've been listening, is I did come from an acting background myself. Go Violets. I was an NYU alum. But, honestly, when I was attempting to do the working artist thing, and I still had this kind of burning desire to have a family and to kind of travel down that road as well, I honestly I kind of thought at one point, well, which one is more important to me, because these two things don't go together, you know. And I did decide, maybe I need to look at other things, because I wasn't enjoying starving while acting, but also it just didn't seem to me like the lives were conducive to each other. So for those of us who maybe come from some more creative background, how in the world did you figure out how to continue doing art and doing directing and doing the things that you do and have kids? Because you and I discussed, it's pretty freaking rare to be a working mom in the theater world.
Yeah, that's 110% true. So the reason I'm still directing comes down to like this one moment. So I'll just tell you this like little story. So before I had children, I was finishing my Master's of Fine Arts, and I was getting ready to go to Michigan to work on a production of Julius Caesar with the Pigeon Creek Shakespeare Company, which is a wonderful touring company in Michigan. And right before I left, I had a meeting with one of my professors, and he said, sort of in passing, "Oh, do you have any kids?" And before I could answer, he said, "Oh, you must not, because you wouldn't be going to do this thing in Michigan." And I was so stunned, I could not even find words to respond to him. I was pretty sure he would not have said that to a male student. But I also, at the time, my husband and I were trying to have a child, and it was taking longer than we thought it was going to. And I remember thinking, oh, am I going to have to give all this up? And like, it hadn't occurred to me that I would need to make this decision. I had a professor in grad school who had a baby while I was in school, and who seemed to be like doing the professional artist thing and the mom thing and like really killing it. Um, and I just thought, oh wait, is this a choice I have to make? Oh, I hadn't really thought about it that way before. And then, so I went to Michigan, did this show, and it was super fun. And one night late in the process, right before we opened, Catherine Mayberry, the executive director, was giving me a ride back to where I was staying. And she said, this has gone really well. We'd love to have you back sometime. And I said, I don't know if I'm going to be able to come back anytime soon. Like, it could be years. And she said, what are you talking about? And I was like, well, we're hoping to have a baby. And my professor said this thing. And she was like, that is the stupidest thing that I've ever heard. We will always find a way for you to come work with us. And at that moment, I didn't realize how big that was. But I remember thinking,
Right.
well, if at least this one theater will take me. And in the years since then, I've realized that she gave me 3 gifts in that instant. And like, the first one's the obvious one. Our theater will always find a space for you. And it's worth noting she does not have any children. So when I tell this story, oftentimes people assume that she's a mom and she like knows, the struggle. But no, she's just a really great person. And she and her board have gone above and beyond to make it possible for me to continue working with them. So 2.5 years after that conversation, I was back there with my toddler and newly pregnant. And they found donated housing for us with some empty nesters who had a big basement and who had grandkids around my son's age. And so like their house was baby proofed. They understood the toddler thing. They helped me find sitters when one of my sitters suddenly couldn't do it anymore. And through the years, I've now done 6 productions and 2 remounts with them. And they always have been very welcoming of my children, even though most of them are not parents. Most of the people involved don't have any kids, but they're always like, oh, your kids need to come to the production meeting? Fine. Your kids need to come to the load-in? That's okay. And so that's been really wonderful. But also, because she was so just like, well, whatever about it, it made me feel like it's not a big deal. She was like, well, of course we'll work with you. Surely anyone will. And so over the years, I've been able to kind of claim my space about that. So like recently, I did a show at York College in Pennsylvania, and as I was talking with them, they said, look, we know you have kids. What do you need to make this possible for you? And we ended up doing a kind of a compressed rehearsal schedule so that I was there 4 days a week and then home 3 days instead of being there 5 days a week and home 2 days for several weeks. And also which days they were. They were able to shift it so it was mostly weekends. So my husband was home. And having had Catherine and then subsequently her board be so just like, well, of course we'll help you out, has made me be like, okay, other theaters, I can ask these things too. Like that's a relatively small budget theater.
Empowering.
Surely anybody else who wants to work with me can do this. And then the third one, which I think is possibly the most important, is that she said to me before anybody else had even had the opportunity to, that I am an artist separate and apart from my status as a parent, and that will always be true. And I've been through experiences in my life that have put me in a position where people have treated me like the most important thing about me is that my body can make other people. Right. And having this person say, no, I see you for who you are. You are more than that.
Your identity includes parenting, but it doesn't solely encompass that.
Exactly. And so I think like for anybody, giving yourself permission to be like, this is not a big deal. A lot of people are parents. Like we can figure this out. And surrounding yourself with people who see you for who you really are. Like those are the two things that have made this possible.
That's awesome. That's awesome. So let's pretend for a moment, we're kind of wrapping up here. You've got some parents out there listening to this right now. You have some homeschool mom listening who maybe has a similar background in the arts like we do. What would be that kind of one word of encouragement you would want to leave them with today?
So some people act like I'm selfish for continuing to do my art while also parenting because it takes time away from my kids. And the thing that I always tell people is like, when my daughter grows up, I would never want her to abandon her dreams because she gave me grandchildren. And the way that I can encourage her to live her fullest life is to not put my dreams on her, but to live my dreams myself and show her that it's possible. And so I think there is a way in which choosing to live your biggest life is a way of doing a service to your children rather than taking away from them.
That's awesome. I love that. Choosing to live your biggest and best life. That's awesome. As we wrap up our episode today, I want to thank you all for listening in. There are a ton of great podcasts out there, but you chose to spend your time here with me, so thank you. Please be sure to check out all of the show notes for the links to my site, workingwhilehomeschooling.com, and all of the great ways you can connect with us online. We do appreciate our listener supporters as well. If you've enjoyed today's podcast, you too can support us with a small monthly donation that will help us continue the great content and interviews like you've heard here today on the Working While Homeschooling podcast. Please check out the show notes for the link. We appreciate your online reviews, all of you that have subscribed to our podcast, and thank you to all of you who have been sharing this with your homeschooling friends. If you know someone that you think would be a great guest of our podcast, please let me know at julie@workingwhilehomeschooling.com. Thank you for listening in today. Thank you to Aili for being our guest and talking to us about their experience with their theater directing career. And make sure you all join us in our Facebook group for continuing conversation on today's topic and beyond. I look forward to seeing each of you soon at our next podcast for Working While Homeschooling.